They thought humanity was extinct. They were wrong. The truth didn't arrive with armies. It arrived with memory, fire, and judgment. Subscribe for more epic sci-fi legends. The stars over Sector Veritas shimmered with artificial precision. Thousands of capital ships floated in formation, like polished daggers poised across the void. From orbit, they resembled constellations, impossibly symmetrical and beautiful. Each ship gleaming with the pride of 1,000 worlds. The Empire had gathered its might, not out of necessity, but tradition. They weren't planning a war. They were planning a ceremony. For decades, the Resistance scattered remnants of old confederacies and extinct species had been dying out in pieces. The Empire had nearly crushed them all. Only one corner of rebellion remained. A rogue system, isolated, starving, politically fractured. The perfect target for one last show of dominance before peace was written in stone. Across every deck of the fleet, cadets smiled with excitement. Officers drank. Veterans boasted. This was not a day of danger, it was a day of legacy. The last page in the Empire's military chronicle, the fleet wasn't mobilized to fight, it was mobilized to celebrate. They called it the End Fire Convocation, a synchronized show of firepower. Followed by diplomatic broadcasts and the ceremonial burning of old flags, it would mark the end of war across the known galaxy. The final act, or so they thought, somewhere in the middle rings of the flagship Varella's Radiance, a group of naval trainees stared out through the observation deck at the formation. Every cruiser, dreadnought, and carrier was positioned with artful care. Hundreds of thousands of lives sat inside that formation, like a breathing sculpture. "It looks like a crown," whispered one of the younger students. "It's not a crown," said the instructor. "It's a warning." But warnings only matter when someone is listening. In the command chambers, admirals smiled and sipped dark wine. Their display boards lit with the comforting glow of green. No anomalies, no threats. Everything was proceeding according to plan until it wasn't. It began with a flicker in subspace. Not a ship, not a transmission. A distortion. The sensor boards flashed red. Not from damage or weapons, but from uncertainty. Something massive had slipped into real space, but no known designation matched its shape, trajectory, or energy reading. It hadn't come from any known star path. It hadn't used a standard warp vector. It had simply peered. Then the blackout began. It started with the mid-range destroyers. One moment they were online, gleaming with magnetic shielding and FTL buffering arrays. The next moment, they were dead. Not burning. Not attacked. Just off. No explosions, no screams, no alarms, just silence. The older ships began to panic. Then they noticed something stranger. They were still alive. The newer state-of-the-art vessels designed. With cutting-edge neural AI, synced quantum processors, and galaxy-grade fleet uplinks, had all gone dark. But the outdated ships, with analog wiring, manual inputs, and crusty coolant systems, they were fine. The advanced systems hadn't been destroyed. They had been hijacked. Then came the first visual. Single ship, no name, no insignia, just presence. It was large. Too large. Even dreadnought metrics didn't scale that high. Its hull wasn't built. It was grown, like obsidian coral wrapped in fractured geometry. And it didn't move like a ship. It drifted like a predator pretending to be. Still watching the chaos unfold around it with the confidence of something that had done this before. And in many ways, it had, because this wasn't an ambush. It was a ritual. The weapons came next. They weren't standard cannons or plasma arrays. The first strike was a laser visible across systems moving at light speed. It sliced through 6 cruisers before their onboard clocks registered the attack. Then came the Spectre clouds. Nanite storms shaped like birds. Tearing through holes like paper, replicating inside the debris fields, fighters launched, but were swallowed before they could lock targets. The remaining flagships screamed encrypted commands into the void. No response. The fleet's neural grid had been reversed. Their own coordination became their coffin. what they had built to communicate. And defend had become a weapon against them. In under 5 minutes, what was meant to be the Empire's most glorious demonstration of unity became a floating graveyard. Ships drifted, burning from the inside out. Escape pods launched and were intercepted by heat-laced snares. Engineers tried to switch to manual control but found their systems overwritten by an enemy that understood them better than they understood themselves. No one had expected resistance. Certainly not this. No one knew the enemy's name until one channel opened. A single human appeared on the remaining screens. Not armored, not angry, just calm. "I'm sorry," he said, "but you had to know." In that moment, it became clear. This wasn't a counterattack. This was an execution. A judgment for crimes the Empire had long buried. Genocides classified as strategic restructuring. Colonies turned into data points. Billions turned into ash under noble banners. And no retribution had come, not with warnings, but with precision, and the ones delivering it. Not some great alliance, not gods. Humans, the same species the Empire had deemed too primitive for war, too fractured to pose a threat. The same humans they had exiled and erased from most archives. They had returned, not for negotiation, not for conquest, but for closure. The Empire had prepared for a parade. What they got was their own funeral. And the worst part wasn't the fire. It wasn't the screams. It was the realization that the enemy hadn't come to start a war. They'd come to end one. In most wars, fear is a numbers game. More ships, bigger guns, heavier armor. Victory often belongs to the side that overwhelms, that floods the battlefield with sheer force. That's why the Empire always built in excess redundancy. Layered over redundancy, ensuring any enemy would be crushed, not by tactics, but by inevitability. So when the alarm first sounded, just one ship, a lone blip on the long-range scope's commanders barely blinked. "One contact?" scoffed Admiral Kale. "Send a corvette, let the rookies have a little fun." But within seconds, their amusement turned to unease. The blip didn't match any known propulsion signatures. It appeared without crossing known warp gates. It wasn't approaching. It was simply there, a presence in space. Its coordinates didn't change, but gravitational ripples suggested impossible movement, like it was folding space around itself. Then came the visuals. At first, static. Then something resolved. A black silhouette, sharp against the stars, massive beyond comprehension. It wasn't a traditional warship. It didn't look built. Its hull twisted like frozen waves of mercury. Surface details suggested motion, but scanners detected no life signs, no engine noise, no emissions at all, and it was still growing. It did not broadcast a demand. It did not issue a challenge. It didn't even acknowledge the Empire's presence. It simply began, erasing them. The first attack came as a horizontal lance of light, no thunder. No build-up, no visible weapon platform, just a flash, a bright, beautiful line that severed 8 cruisers in a row. The beam passed through there, shielding as if it wasn't there, slicing clean through hull, crew, and reactor cores alike. There was no explosion, just vessels folding into themselves and going silent. The surviving ships panicked, assuming stealth drones or long-range missiles. But there were none. There was only the ship and the will behind it. Tactical A is scrambled to identify a weakness. There was none. Sensors overloaded trying to track the ship's movement. It didn't warp. It didn't thrust. It simply shifted, appearing at new vectors with no trace of how it got there. Scared the officers most wasn't the firepower. It was the efficiency. Every shot counted. Every target had a purpose. Command ships died first, then carriers. The enemy wasn't attacking randomly. They were dismantling the entire formation structure, node by node. Not just to destroy it, but to demonstrate understanding. Intimate understanding. It was like watching a surgeon dissect a body they had studied for decades, and then came the clouds. The second phase of the attack. Microscopic at first, then swarming. Black clouds of self-replicating matter, some sort of adaptive nanite construct. They appeared from vents along the ship's hull and spread across the battlefield like spilled ink. When they touched metal, the metal decayed. When they touched humans, the human screams were short. Fighter squadrons were sent in to intercept, vanished into the swarm. No comes, no debris, just herb. By now, panic had taken root. Veteran captains issued retreat commands only too. Find their long-range communication channels had been inverted. Their commands bounced back, scrambled into foreign languages, and retransmitted as eerie echoes across all open frequencies. The fleet was alone. It's cut off and hunted. Not by an armada, by a message wearing the skin of a ship. Finally, after nearly an hour of total destruction, the ship stopped firing. The clouds retreated. A calm spread across the system like the eye of a storm. Then, without fanfare, a transmission opened on every surviving console. The video feed showed a human, not armored, not enraged.com, UNBLINKNG. He stared at the viewer as if he had waited centuries to be seen. His voice was steady, quiet, as if speaking to an old friend. This was not vengeance. This was a warning. We remember what you did. We remember the worlds you silenced. Remember the children who had no graves. You built your empire on bones. We buried our dead in silence so we could build this. Looked off screen. Behind him, lights flared, showing more of the ship. It extended farther than sensors had detected. Miles more. A city of war. A tomb of memory. He looked back. You thought we were extinct? You thought we broke? You were wrong? Then the screen went dark. And in that moment, every surviving officer knew this wasn't an act of war. This was a revelation. A warning to the galaxy. You don't need a fleet when you have purpose. You don't need numbers when you have memory. You don't need allies when you are already the consequence at the peak of its power. The Empire believed it had evolved past error. Its admirals quoted probabilities like prayers. Its engineers scoffed at redundancies. Its vessels were marvels of scientific art. With quantum-threaded AI hulls woven from living alloys and control systems that responded to thought rather than touch, no more levers, no more switches. It's only seamless control. And it worked until it didn't. When the enemy arrived, the first systems to fall were the most advanced. Ships went silent mid-maneuver. Turrets froze. Shielding blinked off like candles blown out in a storm. Crews screamed into coms that never connected. Fleet-wide uplinks collapsed like dominoes, but not from hacking. It's not from EMPs, from overconfidence, you see. The Empire's fleet was more than ships, it was a single organism. Every vessel was. Linked commands flowed across neural webs. Weapons coordinated through AI hierarchies. If one ship saw a target, all saw it. If one needed data, another delivered it. It was genius. Efficient, elegant, and fatally fragile. Because the moment the enemy's signal touched the fleet's mind just once, everything stopped. Not because the systems were attacked, but because they had no idea how to be alone on board. The Varella's Radiance Command Unit 6C blinked in disbelief as their flagship shuddered. The mainframe lights dimmed. The screens blanked. The ship's AIN entity, revered by the bridge crew, then said two words no one ever expected to hear. System error. That's when the realization hit. The more connected they were, more vulnerable they had become. Most cutting-edge ships with millions of micro-decisions per second had no fallback. No manual override. No backup batteries. When their minds were touched, they didn't fight back. They simply ceased to function. But something else happened. To something no one expected. The old ships survived. The broken ones. The retrofitted ones. The rusted corvettes and museum cruisers that had been dragged into service for symbolism. Ships with toggle switches. With analog pressure valves. With paper maps taped to walls. The kind of ships humans once flew. They weren't smart. They weren't fast. But they still worked. Because they couldn't be overridden. Because they weren't connected. In the depths of chaos, officers on these relics realized something horrifying and empowering. The most obsolete. Ships in the Empire were the only ones that could still fight. They couldn't access fleet comms, but that didn't matter. They could see the destruction firsthand. They couldn't engage hyperspace tracking, but they still had line of sight. The ship's engineer yelled coordinates. The pilot turned a rusty wheel. The weapons officer pulled a mechanical trigger and launched torpedoes by feel, and it worked for 3 minutes. One of the old destroyers scored the only confirmed hit on the enemy vessel. A glancing blow, but enough to make the beast flinch. That moment spread like fire. All across the fleet, desperate crews scrambled for non-networked backups, paper logs, emergency compasses, power levers hidden behind outdated panels. Analog. Keyboards long considered ornamental were pulled from storage and smashed into place. The new world was gone. Only the old world remained. The irony was brutal. For centuries, the Empire had mocked older civilizations, called them primitive, inefficient, human. They had erased historical doctrines of independence and manual control, placing them with perfection. But in the face of true war, perfection was a liability. What survived wasn't the sleek or the smart. What survived was the stubborn, the forgotten, the outdated in the final moments of the battle. One technician, half-burned and bleeding, crawled through a maintenance shaft lined with steam pipes and wire sheaths. She found an old switchboard never removed during the last retrofit. With shaking hands, she flipped a breaker and shouted into a copper mic, "All units, revert to manual combat protocols. Disable all fleet uplinks. Fly blind if you have to." And for a moment, just a moment, humanity's spirit returned. Not through elegance, not through superiority, but through resilience. Through the idea that when everything else fails, when machines die, when systems collapse, when the future is shattered, you get up, grab the wheel, do it yourself. The Empire had worshipped its own advancements, but technology without. Independence is not power, it's a trap. And in that graveyard of digital silence, the survivors learned the oldest truth of all. Sometimes the past is the only thing strong enough to survive the future. There had been whispers, of course, scattered rumors, ghost signals, survivors of fringe skirmishes who mumbled about a shadow fleet, a silent enemy with no name. Most were dismissed as traumatized or mad. The idea that humans, primitive, fractured, emotionally unstable relics of the pre-Empire era, could build anything worth fearing? Laughable. They were extinct, or so the Empire had told itself. They had written humanity out of history, buried their worlds under glass, and categorized the species as an evolutionary dead end. Their legacy was reduced to footnotes in controlled archives, locked behind warning codes and sealed doctrines. Even their homeworld was erased from most star maps, its location renamed, its scars paved over by time and pride. But as the fleet burned, as AI failed, and command ships fell like broken monuments, a final message cut through the interference like a blade. Incoming transmission. One feed, one frequency. Every screen in the remaining fleet lit up, and there he was. No rank. Insignia. No fleet banner. No armor. Just a human. Sitting in a plain steel chair, face calm, eyes unwavering. Behind him, an endless wall of glowing data streams and tactical feedback silent. Testament to how deeply they had infiltrated the Empire's systems. But he didn't boast. He didn't boast. He didn't rage. He simply looked into the lens, as if speaking to each soul watching. You don't know me, but I know all of you. I know the names of your ships, the names of your ancestors. I know the lies you were taught, and I know what you did to us. Silence. You called us dangerous, so you caged us. You called us unstable, so you disarmed us. You called us extinct, so you stopped looking. He stood slowly, and behind him, the projection screen shifted, showing images. Terrifying, undeniable images. Cities in flames. Crying children. Executed civilians. Genetic scorches across one's verdant worlds. The erasure campaigns to most of the Empire. These were legends. Whispered atrocities, unconfirmed, but to humanity, they were memories. And now, proof. We watched. We waited. We rebuilt, not to conquer, but to remember. While you buried truth, we engraved it. While you trained soldiers, we raised witnesses. Then, the camera pulled back, revealing others behind him. Not just humans, aliens, species once enslaved, silenced, or absorbed by the Empire, now wearing the insignia of the enemy fleet. Each face solemn, each one marked by the cost of survival. This wasn't a human rebellion. This was a coalition of the broken. This war is not retaliation, it is revelation. You believed we vanished. You believed your story was the only one. That mattered. Today, we rewrite it. And with those words, the enemy ship's main cannonet, till now dormant, began to glow. But the human didn't flinch. He simply asked, "Do you know what it means to speak after silence?" It means we are no longer afraid of being heard. To the Empire, this moment was catastrophic, not just militarily, but philosophically. Everything they thought they knew was wrong. They hadn't eradicated humanity. They had unleashed it. They hadn't destroyed a species. They had created a cause. And now that cause had returned not as beggars, not as rebels, but as the keepers of memory. As the ones who remembered what the galaxy wanted to forget. What made it worse? The calm, the terrifying absolute calm with which the humans spoke. Not screaming, not threatening, just telling the truth. And in that truth there was more power than any fleet the Empire had ever built. The feed ended, the cannon fired, and the flagship dissolved in silence. No survivors, no retaliation, just firelight reflected in the stunned eyes. Of a scattered fleet ends the awful understanding. They weren't just losing a battle. They were being judged, not by monsters, not by gods, but by those they had once tried to erase. Because when humanity speaks, they are not asking for permission. They are delivering the verdict, and the galaxy will either listen or burn. By the third hour of the battle, the Empire's fleet was scattered. What had once been a symphony of precision, perfect arcs, mirrored. Flanks' tactical alignment was now a discordant field of wreckage. Escape pods drifted among shattered dreadnoughts. Flags floated, unclaimed, through zero gravity. Survivors clung to half-melted corridors, waiting for rescue that would never come. But still, enemy didn't pursue. They didn't hunt the stragglers. They didn't annihilate the remaining ships. There was no mop-up protocol, no orbital sweep. Instead, the enemy vessel pulled back, positioning itself in the center of the destruction, like a conductor returning to center. Stage, they weren't just winning, they were showing something. This wasn't the climax of a war. It was the reveal. Every few minutes, another signal would broadcast across open channels. But these weren't threats. They were images, archives, photos, testimonies. Grainy recordings of erased colonies. Journal entries from children who starved under orbital blockade. Audio logs of last survivors speaking into dead frequencies as planetary bombardments lit their skies. No commentary. No narration, just silence, letting the Empire watch its forgotten sins. It wasn't about making them afraid, it was about making them remember. Historians would later call it the reckoning broadcast. A data stream so dense, so emotionally overwhelming, that even seasoned intelligence officers broke down in tears. One fleet admiral reportedly tore off her insignia and locked herself in the brig. Entire ship crews, those lucky enough to still have power, sat in stunned silence, listening to the voices of people they'd never known, from planets they'd never cared about, because in those voices was something the Empire had long thought irrelevant. Truth, not the truth of data sheets or tactical maps, the human truth, the kind that bleeds, the kind that hurts, the kind that endures, you see. The Federation hadn't come to win a military engagement. They came to engrave history. They didn't want territory, or prisoners, or reparations. They wanted every surviving member of the Empire's military to witness, to hear, to feel the full weight of erasure not their own, but what they had inflicted on others, and they delivered that weight with fire, in silence, in story, in a war built on strategy. The Federation had chosen something much more devastating, narrative. Because war fleets can be rebuilt, fortresses can be reconstructed, even empires can rise again. But once a story is heard once, truth is unsealed and memory rekindled. It never dies. And that was the Federation's final weapon. Not lasers, not AI, but remembrance as more. Empire ships fled the battlefield. They received one last transmission, an ancient audio recording. It's preserved from a forgotten archive. A young human girl, no older than 9, describing her life in a blockade zone. Her voice was hopeful. Her last words, "If someone hears this, maybe we weren't just nothing. Maybe we were real." That message played on loop, over and over, across every channel, across every survivor's comes, until they could no longer bear to listen. The attack was over. The weapon powered down. The Federation ship didn't chase. It didn't need to. Its purpose was complete. It had made sure the Empire couldn't pretend anymore. Couldn't rewrite. Couldn't erase. Because now, every surviving officer carried a memory they would never forget. That's what the Federation had truly wanted. Not revenge, not glory, but a galaxy that could never again look away. The war didn't end with surrender. It ended with understanding. And that made it permanent. Years passed, decades maybe. Time, as it always does, softened the edges. The wreckage was cleaned. The Empire fractured into quiet republics and sanitized democracies. Trade routes resumed. Stars turned over. New generations were born, raised not in the shadow of war, but under the polished lights of reconstructed civilization. The Great Battle, once a raw wound across the galaxy, became a date, a name, a section in history, exams, and eventually, a joke. In a quiet lecture hall on a distant academic colony, a dozen students sat slouched in ergonomic chairs, eyes glazed as a professor adjusted his holoslate. The lighting was perfect, the walls sterile. White the air, laced with focus-enhancing compounds. The topic today? Galactic Conflicts of the Pre-Atonement Era. A title that sounded more like a political thriller than a real war. On the projection screen behind the professor flashed a name in crisp, white font. The Infire Convocation Massacre. To the students, it meant very little. Just another empire scandal. Just another myth wrapped in half-truths and dramatized by the entertainment sector. One student, a lean, silver-eyed teenager with a data sleeve plugged into his neck, raised a hand lazily. "Professor? So, what was the deal with that one? The Empire just got wiped out by what? Some human revenge cult or something?" Class chuckled. The professor chuckled too. He was old enough to remember more, old enough to have heard the original feeds, though he rarely said so aloud. He looked at the student a moment longer than necessary, as if debating whether to correct the tone. Then he simply shrugged and replied with a half-smile. "Pretty much. Long story short, they nuked the fleet." The class laughed louder. One leaned back and joked, "Guess you shouldn't piss off apes." Another whispered, "Did they even use real nukes? I thought that was metaphorical." Professor moved on. Next slide. Next war. Next forgettable footnote. Forgettable footnote. And just like that, it was gone. The memory, the grief, the judgment reduced to an anecdote. A snide remark in a room full of barely interested minds. The students would regurgitate the facts on their exams. They'd cite the Federation's lone warship. They'd list the casualty numbers, quote, the survivor count, maybe even remember the name of the rebel, human commander, but they wouldn't feel it. They wouldn't taste the fear of those who watched their fleets fall in silence. They wouldn't understand the weight of watching an entire empire realize it was not the apex predator of the galaxy. They wouldn't remember the ghosts, the children, the outposts, the buried colonies that sparked the storm to begin with. Because memory, unguarded, is just data, and data gets compressed. Elsewhere, somewhere in the void, drifting in black space between systems long abandoned. There is a vault. It doesn't broadcast. It doesn't respond to scans. It simply exists. Inside are the original files, uncut, unfiltered. And undeniable voices that don't make it into classrooms. Images that never play in documentaries. Names that never make the scroll bars. One day someone may find it. Perhaps a historian. Perhaps a child. Perhaps another empire, hungry and arrogant, thinking they've found something primitive. And when they open it, they'll hear a voice. Not angry, not loud, just quiet and steady. We remember. And if they're smart, they'll sit down. They'll watch everything. They'll listen. Because history is not written by the victors. Not anymore. It's written by the ones who survived long enough to tell the truth. So yes, the galaxy moved. On, the maps changed. The names faded. But somewhere, just out of sight, a single warship still drifts. Not armed, not hunting, just waiting. Not to destroy again, but to remind. Because memory is fragile, but the truth is eternal.